Well, hello, 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 all my favorite people. I'm Kylie, and I welcome you to the Rebel Girls podcast. Today, I have with me Dr. Bird, but I'm not the one to do any type of introduction. So, Dr. Bird, could you please give us your pronouns, your location, and what exactly it is that you do in life?
Sure. I mean, I'm Dr. Bird. The full name, as you can see, Dr. Bernadette Bird Bowen. My pronouns are capital she, they, doctor, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure. And I am a critical media ecologist, which I imagine we'll also talk more about. But really, in a basic sense, I look at the way that media influence our environment and specifically how we come to know who we are. We build our identities, how we relate to others, and then how we exist within usually within my research, the US context. So for
Well,
better and for worse. Yeah.
I'm so incredibly excited to have you on here today. Now, very recently, in some of the interviews I've conducted, people have talked a lot about how the pandemic and how media influenced their development during the pandemic. So I know there's so many people that are going to find your information valuable. But before we get to any of the fun stuff, we have to start from the beginnings because we're telling a story here, right? We're telling a story about you. So I need to know, what are the three emojis that best describe little old bird at about 10 years old? Help set the stage for us, shall we?
Sure. I mean, I think the most obvious one that I started with, and I don't know how much you've peeped the emoji game I've had going on since being a content creator the last couple of years, but I always have that little yellow bird. It's just like the basic bird, but I chose, since it was supposed to be me, like as little bird, I chose the one in the little eggshell. Because I think that, I'm just in my memoirs, I split up my memoir into three parts, and the first one is called Lil Bird, and I feel like it just encapsulates like the innocence of someone who has a lifelong dream of bird that's just trying to do the best that they can in the world that currently exists. I've also played a lot of video games my whole life, so I figure a game controller would be appropriate. Though, yeah, and it's funny. The one that they have, at least on iPhone, is like the Sega one, which is like, I feel like a pretty retro choice of them. I was surprised that that's the emoji that they have, but
Notice, but that
I
okay.
know I'm know my controllers. Yeah, it's very much like old school, but I feel like it's appropriate. I have a sister that's 11 years older than me, and she like grew up with all the old consoles, so I kind of like got them, you know, from adoption of the family. And then I also grew up like on old Nickelodeon and Disney and stuff, so I think one of the old box TVs kind of plays into both. So I think those are the three I would choose. I've always been into studying media, but like from a different kind of sense as a child, obviously, just like fascinated in how it all. So that's, I think, my three would be.
Oh, I love those. I've never had any of those. Now I
Oh,
know we
really?
have, really, yeah, you could
I love that.
completely unique emojis, which is like kind
Cool.
of rare. Now I have to, because I know we have a lot
Oh,
of
sure.
gamers on
Good.
our little community here. I
Yeah.
need to know for them, what's your
Oh,
favorite
sure.
game? What?
Okay, so I'm very particular. I love, have you ever played any of the Elder Scrolls games, or if anyone's ever played any of them? Okay, so like I started with, there's like three really popular ones, I feel like, at least for like my age group, and I'm in my early 30s. So like I played Morrowind first. It's like a kind of, I don't you have you ever heard of Fallout? Because that
Yeah,
they're made by it's
there.
okay, so yeah, it's made by the same company, Bethesda, but this is like a fantasy version basically, rather than like a post-apocalyptic kind
Okay,
of version. So,
so
but yeah, the second one is what I love. It's called Oblivion. It's like
okay.
there's a specific, this is where I was saying it's niche. There's a sub, like it's like an expansion pack. It's called the Shivering Isles, and it's basically you start out by entering this portal that's in this like weird, like, as an island, as you could guess, and then you enter this realm of like these two paths run by someone that's kind of like an old god of chaos, almost kind of like Loki vibes,
Okay.
but his name is Lord Sheogorath, and you basically choose whether you're going to go down a path of mania or dementia, which is like either really like hyper, like, as you'd guess, in a or same kind of realm as like how people distinguish between bipolar phases, like
Oh,
one that's either like hyper euphoric or one that's like intensely depressing, but like morbid and like kind of, yeah, it's a fascinating one. It's like
Sounds really, really intense. Now, I'm not a
it is.
gamer, but I'm gonna try my vocabulary. Is this
Oh, sure.
is it an RPG?
You
Is
bet. Yep. I
ah
love that you knew that.
okay, look at
Yeah.
me. All right,
Yeah.
bonus for me.
Yeah.
RPG. Okay, well, for all the other gamers out there, if you happen to know this super,
People will
they're gonna
they'll
know.
know it. If they know it, they know it.
I'm gonna have to see. Everyone in the comments needs to blow this up. If you know Dr. Bird's game, I need to know. I need to know who knows the game because I certainly don't.
I trust that they'll know.
You- I'm what? There'll be like 100,000 people who are like, "That's my favorite game."
Literally. So there's two camps. People either really love Oblivion, or they're like all about the newest
Ooh,
one called Skyrim. It came out in like 2011. It's big because it came out in 11/11/11, like
oh,
November 11th, 2011, and then they've just recreated the game like 1,000 times ever since.
oh,
um,
wow.
a new one's supposed to come out because I mean, it's got a cult following, like it genuinely does. So, but yeah, it's a big deal. It's more beautiful and like newer, so people usually like that, and it's great for what it is. But Oblivion has my whole heart.
Okay, all right. So let us know what team you're on in the comments. I'm super curious. This is like the best social experiment I've ran in a really long time. All right, Dr. Bird. Well, I love your emojis. It sounds like you had a very specific interest pretty early on,
Oh
right?
yeah,
Yeah, you
for
had
sure.
like your things, right? Now,
Yeah.
you had your things, but I'm curious.
Hmm.
Our show is a lot about capturing how we ourselves function in the world and how, from
Oh
even an
sure.
early age, we're impacted by outside expectations or ideas. So, was there anything when you were a kid that you felt like, oh, I have to be this certain type of way? Where did that come from?
Oh yeah. I mean, so I guess I've got a very different understanding now in comparison to when I was younger. And I talk about this like in the first chapter, especially in my memoir, but like I feel like at 3 decades later, I have a very different understanding of like how I existed in the world when I was a child or adolescent versus now. And like realistically, a lot of me growing up, because I am a late in life realized neurodivergent person, like I'm autistic specifically, and I meet all the criteria, but also resonate with like the new experiential type of idea of like how assigned female at birth folks, and especially black and brown folks, like weren't diagnosed because we were just completely missed and fell through the cracks. um that's how my experience of gender basically has been formed, is like I was following everyone else's lead, but it became very clear to me after like going through teens and 20s, but also like at the time, that I was not allowed to like be what I actually naturally felt like who I was. So, and I laugh because it's like it's a horrible thing that no one should have to experience, but like as a means of doing what I need to do, like you got to laugh at what you've survived, because I think otherwise it gives it too much power. But this is to say that like I think growing up I was either deeply confused realistically, because I was following other people's leads, and there wasn't like it became very clear to me, of course, like as a non-binary neuroqueer person that didn't know that like I did not fit in with any other like young girls. Like that was not something, yeah, like I and it's like it's I think was what was so weird is it was like I grew up understanding that I looked femme, like and I didn't know what that meant really, but like I got through realistically like meticulously observing others and then doing research and like being like what's the world about, like learning that like other people's impressions of me and expectations of me were completely out of my control, and I was at the whim of others expectations. So I think I grew up with a lot of like, well, you got to wear a dress, or like, and I always fought that even from when I was like single digits, you know what I mean? And I remember there being kind of like tensions, and my family did it the best that they could as they had, I like to think. But because my parents are boomers, they had like more traditional ideas of gender, even though they saw themselves as a bit more progressive. I think they still very much like in implicit ways impressed this like very traditional feminine kind of perspective on who I was, and I just bucked it like almost always, because again I was just playing video games basically my entire childhood and like trying to be an adventurer, and as anyone that's played video games, especially like millennials or older knows, every single main character in a video game is basically a white guy. so so like I was in a strange way on the outside, like both in family, but also like as I come to meet and hang out with like neighborhood friends that were girls, I realized that these things were constantly mischaracterizing me, and that like I felt much more in tune with like a little adventurer boy that was like gonna go and do whatever the hell they wanted and save the world. like, and like it's funny because like I honestly think that like that's why, as someone that's spent so much time now learning about identity and gender specifically, because like I have a certificate in women, gender, and sexuality studies, as well as like alongside my PhD. And it's funny because thinking back, like I spent most of my time either, like I said, playing the video games or going out and hanging out with neighborhood boys that lived like behind me. And like we would play like Street Fighter or like kick the can. And like I would be the only like person assigned female at birth there. And they'd be like, why aren't you going to play house with like are people that live across the street that are like are young girls? And I'd be like, I don't like them. And then I had to develop like a classic tomboy kind of persona, because I like learned very quickly that since I did not fit in because of little spats or because it just didn't feel natural to me, especially as a millennial born and raised in the 90s and 2000s, I developed a lot of that like self-hatred early on, I think, of like,
Yeah.
well, I'm just not like them. And it's like, it just sucks. It sucks that that's something that so many of us have resonated with. And it's like, yeah, I think so. This is to say that my experience of gender is very complicated, and I'm still obviously like working through it and getting through it. But I think now that I, in hindsight, can understand the way that it's been formed and the social expectations, obviously, of traditional like binary femininity and masculinity, and like this idea that you have to be one or the other, and that I've never fit into either of those boxes, it's made my life make a lot more sense.
I'm so glad that you've been able to get that clarity, because I
Yeah.
feel your experience to my core. That wanting to be like that adventurer, and then people not really understanding in your community, or even sometimes like in my family like you probably did the best they could, but it was
Yeah.
like, okay, Kylie's just Kylie. Kylie, Kylie's just Kylie. And
Yeah.
she's gonna do her books and she's gonna do her things. And I was very
Yeah.
thankful to have sports, because very easily I got
Oh, sure.
who's just athletic. That's just what
Yeah.
that is, and that was a niche for me.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
glad that video games kind of gave you something, because otherwise
Yeah.
it kind of would have sucked for all of us, right?
Oh, and it did. That's the thing. It did suck. But no, you're right. It would have been so much worse without like some sort of outlet, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Ah, okay. So little
Yeah.
bird, doing her thing, being herself, maybe not really
Mm,
fitting with the people around her. Now, how did
yeah.
this progress? Was it going
Mm,
away to college? Was it your 20s that the major,
mm,
like, what was it that helped you transition to where you are now? Because you seem
mm,
much more confident, you seem much more, I think,
mm.
sure of yourself than what you formally described.
I mean, I'm gonna be honest, it was a shit show. It was a total shit show. It was literally so that like when I'm thinking back and describing like that experience, it probably really is. And that's what's so interesting to me actually about your question. Because as I was thinking about like what emojis I would choose to describe me at 10, it would be a very different choice of emojis than me like 2 years later. Because me 2 years later is like where like the tides kind of turn, as it happens from like grade school into like middle school and elementary school. And I think a lot of what my story differs from like other folks that are late in life realized autistic is I went the punk kid route. I went the substance abuse route. Like I went and I grew up born and raised in Chicago. So like there was a great scene, and there is to this day. Not that I would know because I'm always just like over in Ohio now. But yeah, like I grew up going to shows and like just blending in. Like I was like very much the role of like quintessential, like I was always deemed manic pixie dream girl, that kind of thing, even though I didn't understand what was happening, and I was just trying to like not get eaten alive by bullies, even, and it didn't work, like like to be so clear, like my transition from like sixth grade into seventh grade was like so confusing and so like just in hindsight, like I remember I have this distinct memory for some reason of like being at a locker in like a really long t-shirt, like, you know, like one of those with like
Mhm.
shorts under it, and just feeling like I saw like a best friend from like fifth grade, and like seeing that she like went through puberty and like has like a boyfriend now and stuff, and just thinking like, what? Like,
That's weird.
like, yeah, like, like what? Where did all of like, and that's like such a persistent theme for me is like, where did all my friends go and where did the falling outs happen? And like, because I was either, you know, how we were talking earlier, how your kiddo is like potentially like an old soul. That's how I was always referred to as a kid. And then as I grew older, I was kind of referred to as if I like didn't mature at the same age, which is, it was such a confusing and like strange dichotomy where I basically like to blend in, I just became almost identityless, to be honest,
Right.
because I realized that like there wasn't, and I was also always like, I always knew that I was queer. And I, again, born and raised in the 2000s, where, and I was in Indiana, by the way, a region of Chicago, like in Northwest Indiana. So it was, there's just no way I could be openly out. And that was something that I always held close to my chest, and I learned really early on that like people were using gay as an insult, etc.
Oh,
So
yeah.
all of these things, you know, like, and as we know, right, because neuroqueerness as a gender, it encapsulates not just like your gender identity, but also like obviously how that relates to like preference and how people understand things, and how there's always like a gap there, and like within a deeply inequitable system and horribly hateful Indiana context, like I didn't stand a chance of being who I actually am. And it just like how my experience of gender kind of became, well, I'm not like those other girls. Blah. Like the idea, it's like this vicious cycle of like, well, let me just it be everything that I am against now. Like the reason I have any belief that I have now is because I was immersed in all of the hate based norms that are bound into this nation. Like, because it's like I can't talk about my experience of gender also obviously without talking about my whiteness. I can't talk about my experience of gender without talking about my class. And I was born and raised into a family who like my parents were both relatively like poor growing up, but then my dad got a job at BP. So I was like born and raised in a subdivision, but like, you know, like newer middle class, if you could say that. So it was like, yeah, it was weird. It was like I was stuck between this boomer generation of parents that like had working class backgrounds, but were like trying to prove something of themselves, I think. And trying to like, they were always very concerned what the neighbors thought. And this was like baked into my experience of growing up. Cause like who I was very much like someone that was taught to be ashamed of who they are, but like bucked that at the same time in little ways.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's like it's confusing. I feel like when I'm describing it, it like may not make sense to people unless they've lived a similar trajectory. Cause it's like, but that is what it is. I guess it doesn't need to make sense to anyone else because that is what happened.
No,
So
I think you did a really good job
yeah,
of describing the experience, though. It's like this constant trying to raise to an occasion and then like being hateful of the experience that you're having to face because it's
yeah,
not fitting and it's
yeah,
largely generated by these just asinine ideals that humans
yeah,
replicate. Yeah. No, I
yeah.
understand what you're describing, and I think you did a really good job of it for what it's worth.
Thank you.
Now, I want to talk for a second about so a lot of self-discovery here because you said
hmm
late in life you did go through the diagnostic process and
hmm
perhaps gained a little bit of clarity about your own experience and how you identify in the world. Would you mind exploring that a little bit with us today?
Oh, sure. Oh, and just to be clear, so the last basically, I'm 34. The last 4 years have me be basically learning everything about what autism even is. Because when I was describing like a turning point and I was describing everything just a moment ago, I'm really getting into like, it was a shit show. And then once I hit like 25 is when I started like rebuilding a sense of self, basically. I suppose I could have continued with that, but it was so confusing because I feel like I was very much led in a way that I can't quite describe by like a series of little events that like were very opportune and honestly baked into like a queer identity that I hadn't realized was going to be the crux of like a turning point in my life. Like the reason that I even have a PhD at all is because I went up to a environmental club booth because I was attracted to a woman behind it and wanted to hit on her.
Okay.
And then she invited me to like a Greenpeace leadership retreat in Virginia. And I ended up going because I was like secretly like, well, I would follow you anywhere. And then they were basically like, oh, you should pick up a minor in communication. And I was like, well, I'm at the end of my sociology degree and I don't know what I'm going to do with this. So, after the life I've lived and a series of violent things that happened in my early 20s, like, what do I have to lose? So I went and it changed the course of my life because I came back, changed my degree, and then ended up pursuing a master's in it and like rebuilding a sense of self. So it's like, there's no way that obviously I could really fully describe like the ridiculousness of living a life of substance abuse in my teens and early 20s and then falling into very much like what was an authentic version of myself all along that I wasn't allowed to embrace.
Mm.
But that was the turning point, basically, is me starting graduate school. Hence why the third pronoun is doctor, because I feel like it's baked into like my sense of self and who I've become in such a deep way that as much as it feels like a gimmick, and in some ways I think is kind of a funny gimmick, it does actually describe my experience of gender at the same time. Like becoming a doctor and a specialist in the things that I have, it's an integral part of my gender. It's in part of how I experience the world and the way that I just like appreciate and deconstruct it. So this is to say that like to answer your question more specifically, I mean, the last 4 years since COVID hit, like I realized that when I was 27, the summer before I moved for my PhD to Ohio, I had seen a YouTube video about people assigned female at birth and their experience of autism. And I sobbed and then I repressed it for years. And I just was like, well, I'm going to move my whole life and leave everyone I've ever known um, to just pursue my dreams. And basically, because of the pandemic hitting, and then that same year, I lost my mom to lung cancer. I was living on blood money, which is like a ridiculous, like, and a privileged experience to have because obviously there's plenty of folks who, their parent or loved one, caregiver of some kind, passes away of lung cancer and then they never see a day of justice. But my mom did sue. So I was able to basically, despite the horror of the pandemic starting and then losing a parent and me living in a different state, I was able to live on blood money and talk about it openly in a way that most PhD students can't afford to do because of the risk of like the social ostracization and like all kinds of other like torments that one goes through when they're grieving, And I like already at that time had been seeing more and more content actually on TikTok of people late in life realizing I was like, this fits me to a T. And I'd forgotten that I'd seen that video from years before. And before the pandemic hit, I'd actually met with a therapist to kind of process more of the violence that I experienced in my early 20s. And they told me straight out, well, you meet all of the criteria for autism, but I'm going to tell you right out, you shouldn't get a diagnosis because it would probably hurt you with your level of education more than it would help you. Like, yeah, like they literally, so, and think about that. Like, think about how horrific it is that a literal mental health professional would say, hey, this world's so discriminatory that I actually don't think that you should get a diagnosis because this could bar you from ever being fully seen as a human. This could bar you from ever obviously being able to like adopt a child, or potentially it could like in certain instances have your license revoked. Not to mention it's somewhere sometimes up to $5,000 to get an official diagnosis. Yeah, and if you can even find someone that would give you an official diagnosis after, this late into life, because it's because the research is only from like the last 15 to 20 years coming out that there is a different experience and lost generations. I'm talking millions, if not billions, of people that have fallen through the cracks of this, despite meeting all the criteria. There's a good chance that I would either not find someone that would be able to do that. I sure as hell wouldn't be able to afford it. And or it would hurt me if I got it because all of the things that I need to like cope with the life that I've lived and the sensory sensitivities now that I've processed a lot of my trauma, and the autistic symptoms have remained, because that's like the main distinguishing factor between if you have complex trauma alone without being autistic, and being autistic and having complex trauma, which most of us have realistically in a deeply ableist society. Um, they said, well, if you can cope with your sensory sensitivities and the social, obviously, difficulties of being an autistic person, I don't think it would be worth that you get a diagnosis. And that's a controversial take, I know, but I believe them. I really do, with everything I've seen.
Right.
So
Well, I mean, to just hit on your point about how so many people have gone without a diagnosis or have not had the access or opportunity. I know there's like
yeah,
this running joke everywhere we go. It's like, oh no, Uncle so and so wasn't just a train collector. He
literally, my dad loves model trains. By the way,
well, you know what they say.
yeah. Like my uncle on my mom's side, they literally studied his brain after he passed away because he built like bridges, and he like, yeah, it's like there's so many. I mean, and again, I just fit everything autistic to a T, and I always have my whole life. So it's like, yeah, it is. It's so genetic, and it's so clear if you know what it looks like.
Right.
And the world is so ableist that unfortunately, you can live your whole life being autistic and not know it because you don't even know what. Like I say in my memoir, I didn't know the difference for most of my life between what it means to be autistic and what it means to have Down syndrome. Like, and it's like these are distinct things. Many times they're comorbid, but not every time.
Right.
And it's like not surprising studying language and knowing norms that like in such a deeply eugenics rooted society that we don't even know who we are because the world is so like completely miseducated and disinformed about what autism is.
Yeah, and so I think there's something about people, and I don't know if it's true about as many people now as it was before,
Mm,
but it seems as though in the past people they were desperate to have a singular label to put on a
mm,
singular person, and once they could put
sure.
a label on that person, then they knew what to expect out of them, and that was
Yeah.
they knew how to handle that person. But as we
Yeah.
begin to understand ourselves and each other a little bit more, like there's no one thing. There's no one thing. So that's not
No,
a
exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. All right. So this is a fantastic. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I can't
Me
believe I
too.
picked brains out of all of the things. Feel bad. All right. So you touched on it a little bit, some of the work that you do, but can you kind of just
Mm,
explain to the general population, like what is it that you
mm,
study, that you're involved in? Like,
sure.
give it to us.
Yeah, so critical media ecology is a framework that I created and I debuted in my dissertation. It's actually, I didn't create the term. And I'll, my mentor in my PhD, my first one, he actually called for critical media ecology, but he was based more in like critiquing education studies. And then he was saying, like, someone should make this into a framework. And so eventually I ended up being like, yeah, because I came from a background, my background's in sociology. I have a master's in communication looking at like transnational and global media, but also, identity research, like I said. So I'd already come in with like a more critical cultural studies kind of background. And a lot of folks in the field of communication don't have that background, to be clear. Like a lot of the time, their bachelor's programs are guided in advertising, marketing, journalism, broadcasting, things that are not like Marxist theory, things that are not anything critical cultural about like the historical and social ways things come to be. And that's what sociology, it's our bread and butter, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I left that field because I noticed the like categorical limitations that sociology was stuck in. And I know that sociology has kind of in recent years worked its way out of it, but I was realizing that I'd always actually fallen more within a communication critical cultural studies kind of camp, which is it's called dialectic theory. Basically, it's like the idea that language builds our worlds. So it's built in a philosophy and psychology and sociology background, but then it puts language on top. And honestly, the field of communication and media studies is relatively new, as you can probably guess. It's a 150, 200 years tops field, which is like a baby field as far as disciplines are concerned. So this is to say that like his background had more of like a philosophic and less critical bent to it. And so I came in and I was like, hey, this field of media ecology that you've introduced me into, which is popularized by Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. They were looking at the way that a lot of theorists prior to my work were studying how technology influences any one environment. So the analogy that I always say is if you have an empty glass of water and you have a dropper of food coloring that's red and you drop a single drop in the glass, it's going to turn the whole glass red. And so the approach, which every media ecologist kind of tackles uniquely, is that's how every technology, when it's introduced into an environment, works, for better and for worse. So this can be anything from as small as an alphabet to as big as a system of power, I argue. And so what my critical media ecology basically says is, hey, this media ecology stuff, it's great. But the vast majority of the folks that are accredited with this like approach are cis white able-bodied men, which is obviously, as every academic discipline is almost always the case when it comes to canon. That's growing, it's changing, I like to think, but critical media ecology adds all the other critical cultural studies into the field that have been neglected. And this is to say, people always say, oh, well, they were men of their time. And it's like, okay, they are kind of, but also there were plenty of other critical cultural studies and theorists that were doing this at the time that they were alive. So for them to neglect all of these other theories that could have been combined, you can say that it was or wasn't intentional, but at the end of the day, the impact is the same. So the way that I've basically extended the field, and me and my colleagues have, because this is, of course, it's not just like me, a one-person show here to save the day, unlike my, video game adventures may have wanted me to pursue in this late-stage capitalist individualistic society. But basically, I have argued that humans act as media in a society building process. And so what I mean by that is that when you go to school to study sociology, because of the way the education system has been built, you're trained into a very specific way of thinking and being that is a sociological approach, right? Like how we were just talking about.
Yeah.
And there's many ways to do sociology. There's many camps of sociology, but that training is a media. So it comes to alter and influence the way that you approach and see the world and the way that you describe it. And whether it's sociology or whether it's any other type of science, basically what's happened, or what I've argued at least has happened, if I'm right, over the last hundreds of years, is we have gone through a process called the mechanization of humans, which basically, through objective ideas, so this belief that there is a world that exists out there that we don't alter, and through claims of universal kind of applications, like this idea that a handful of canonical white men were able to go out and describe how the world is for every single person, as if our social location and experience doesn't uniquely influence the way that we experience the world subjectively. Right? So I'm not really, this is to say, I'm not saying anything new realistically, because critical cultural theorists have said that for a long time. And so have relativists in general. But it's this idea that basically, because of the false universal claims that have been made, these are baked into our education system. And through them, we've come to view the body as a machine, for better and for worse. So in a sense, over a short period of time, this didn't seem like a problem. And in certain senses, it created good things. We've come to understand the way that the body works. We've come to diagram it and understand all kinds of amazing things. But alongside that, we've also come to prioritize a logic that we've associated with white masculinity that is able-bodied over emotion that has been associated and presumed to be feminine and embodied and bastardized. And obviously as well, Black and brown and the global South. And this has led to so many different and endless ecological consequences, for better and for worse. So I've basically just kind of taken this framework and I've said, okay, what do I do with having learned what I've learned and having lived what I've lived? what usefulness can this have for people? And I've tried to water it down to 3 sentences, which is basically, and not watered down isn't the right sentence, but I guess in the ecological analogy I used earlier, I guess it kind of makes sense. Which is, we only know what we know, everything becomes normal in repetition, and everything is connected. Because I think what's most important to me isn't that I'm going around being like, hi, you should listen to me because here's all these fancy pieces of paper I have that make me someone that you should listen to. Because I think that it's the antithesis of what the purpose of my work is meant to do, especially having seen that that is what canon does. And that's why we have an authority gap in the first place. But it's that people understand that their lived experiences are a form of knowledge that they have been taught to dismiss. And I know what that's like. I know what it's like to live a life where I've been taught to dismiss the knowledge that I have. And I can't help but, like, I know you could see the sad, I can't hide the sadness that that holds, but it's so true, you know? Like, and I want people to know that. I want people to understand that they have a knowledge and that knowledge deserves to be heard. So that's all I'm hoping.
I think that it's just so incredible to hear you talk about your discipline coming from the educational sphere.
Yeah.
I cannot describe, I think, accurately how much or how many times I have observed. I'm even getting a little choked up there. Observed children be forced into these paths, and
Yeah.
it's really such a shame because it does make me wonder what we would be capable of if that hadn't occurred or didn't
Yeah.
occur at such a degree, right?
Totally. Yep.
Huh. All right, my friend. Well, I have to say I've really enjoyed our conversation, but there's one more thing I really do have to circle back around to because you've mentioned it
Sure.
more than once. You have a book?
I do.
About it.
So okay, so I have actually, so it's strange. Almost exactly this time last year, I went through like disillusionment with academia, you could say, and I was gonna turn my dissertation into an academic monograph, which I actually just submit the proposal for literally last week. So that's in the works now. Finally, I'm excited.
Yes.
But basically, I put a call out because I was gonna write that book much sooner, and then as I was starting to write it, I was like, I can't really write this book. I feel like without like writing, because I'd been wanting to write memoirs for a long time, and because of like the way things worked out, I ended up writing a 2-part memoir series instead. So like I said, the academic monograph is on its way and I'm going to build on that work. But yeah, I wrote 2 memoirs about basically there's a pre-COVID life, which is obviously the first like 30 some years. And then the second part is all about the last 5, well, going on 5 years of my life and the way that things have changed. Because I think the whole purpose of my work is to forefront a different form of authority. Like, I want people to understand that because of how dehumanized not just our idea of authority is, but also like the way that that bleeds into all facets of our lives, it's important to me to forefront my imperfect humanness first so that people can understand that like they can do that. Like, there is different ways that you can lead and that we need to, you know, like it's literally like, I wish it sounds dramatic. It sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. Like, the current system is hurtling us towards a climate apocalypse in a very serious, real way. And I think it's important that we understand the way our ideas of authority have led us to that point as much as they have potentially helped us.
Right.
And I think, yeah, I think that learning about how we can understand leaders less as distance figures that are like allegedly the greatest minds and instead as imperfect humans who have like not just a logical approach but also an embodied knowledge from going through grief and hardship and coming out of that to survive. I think that's the most important thing, especially if we're talking about the ways that those same logics, when pushed to their furthest most extreme, have dehumanized us and then are causing us to like, you know, have the world the way that it is now. So this is to say that yes, the first one, I talk about my lived experience, but also the way that everything you asked me about in this episode, I talk about that much more extensively, and hopefully the reductive, confusing parts of it that may have been like, people are like, how could you have lived both of these things simultaneously, this book would explain how. I think in a more in-depth way, the first particular volume. And then how I got into graduate school and like the violences that I've lived and the ways that those things are normal, unfortunately, and the unlearning processes that I've had to meticulously go through because of the way that everyone is unfortunately complicit in the ways that norms are. Um, and then the last 4 years of why I see my experience of identity and why relationships are happening the way that they are, unfortunately, in a deeply sexually violent society that's also experiencing a loneliness epidemic and has been for decades, as well as a sex apocalypse. So, yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's the classic the personal is the political. And my memoir is meant to be like kind of a gaudy, not gaudy isn't the right word, I call it an autopsy of the body politic to kind of demonstrate the ways that like these systems of power play out in one individual's life who went through a life of torment that would have otherwise been ignored. You know what I mean? Because that's what happens when you're a late in life realized autistic person is you've been gaslit your whole life and then you at higher rates experience things like substance abuse, sexual violence. There's a significantly higher rate of unaliving. And I'm so socializing a TikTok to not be able to say the word, but like literally, like we are such high rates for these. Like 9 out of 10 assigned female at birth autists experience sexual violence by the age of 18. The vast majority of us experience substance abuse. And these things are often happening behind the scenes in ways that people do not talk about enough. And I know that because of, had I not gotten the degrees that I've had, I wouldn't have been able to tell the story that I did because I wouldn't understand how normal these things are. And I think that as awful as it was to like have to bear in, you know, and choose like to share this like life trajectory, that I hope that my telling it can help people so that they know that like this is not okay, but it is completely normal, unfortunately, and you can survive beyond it.
Yeah. Yeah, you most certainly can. Well, it sounds like an incredible story. Dr. Bird, where would we pick up said book if we ourselves were going through some sort of transformation and could use a little inside expertise?
Sure. So I share everything on my link tree, as one does. But yeah, it's you can really get them on Amazon. I wrote them myself in like a week, basically, with autistic hyperfocus. I have them on there, self-published, and then there's also you can get them almost anywhere books are sold. And I also read them on audiobook.
So if you
Mhm.
like her voice, folks, you can listen to
There
her
you go.
any darn time. And
Yeah.
what's the name of these books? I don't know if we got the name of them.
Oh, sure. So it's the Neuroqueer Self-Realizations and the Algorithmic Environment series. But the first one's called I Have Been the Bad Guy. And the second one is called On Being the Bad Guy. So
Perfect.
you'll see there's like a distinguishing factor between being born and raised into a deeply inequitable society, like genuinely being a bad person, and then choosing to like call those things out. So like bad guy in quotes.
I love it.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Bird. Well, it's been a fantastic interview. So I've got just one final question for you today. If someone is experiencing anything like what you have experienced, what one piece of advice do you feel like they need to hear?
Sure. I think it would be, and I tweeted this out the other day. I think that it would be live the life that your abusers don't want you to live. I,
Oh,
yeah. Yeah.
there it is. I have never had such a good final yes. I always try there if there's one statement in each conversation I could bold, this would be the one for this episode. Yes,
Yeah.
live the life your abuser wouldn't want you to. Oh, that is fantastic. All right. Well, on that note, everyone, Dr. Bird, thank you again so much for spending a little bit of time with us. Everyone, you can check out their book on all of our different platforms as well as Amazon. Thank you so much again. I genuinely appreciate your time. And until next time, everyone, keep being the rebels that you are.